Hello everyone. In last session, we studied about concept of remote sensing as what is the meaning of remote sensing and what are the different definitions given by different scholars for the term remote sensing, and also about the history of remote sensing, that how the concept of remote sensing has evolved over the years. So in today's session, we are going to study about types of remote sensing as well as advantages and disadvantages of remote sensing. So let's start with the types of remote sensing. As you can see a figure, there are two figures showing passive remote sensing and active remote sensing. If you look closely to this figure, you will see that in passive remote sensing, there is a source of energy available, whereas that source of energy, or you can say source of illumination, is not present in active remote sensing, right? So in passive remote sensing, you can also see arrows which are directed towards the earth's surface from the source of energy, and then they are again directed from the earth's surface towards the sensor. But this is not the case with active remote sensing. In figure of active remote sensing, you can see out of four, two arrows are directed towards earth from the sensor, whereas the two other arrows are directed from the earth's surface towards the sensor. So we can explain the difference between active and passive remote sensing as the presence of source of illumination or as the absence of source of illumination. In passive remote sensing, the source of illumination, or as you can say, the source of energy is present, whereas the source of illumination or the source of energy is absent in active remote sensing. Okay, so passive remote sensing always takes place in the presence of any type of source of illumination, may it be sun, may it be any light bulb, any kind of illumination source which is radiating EMR, and with the help of that EMR we are able to see any particular feature. Okay, in active remote sensing, the sensor itself works as the source of illumination. There are pulses or the signals generated by the sensor, and they are radiated towards the earth's surface, and when those signals interact with the earth's surface, they get reflected back towards the sensor. So the source of illumination, or we can say the external source of illumination which is present in passive remote sensing, is hence absent in active remote sensing. So here is the difference. First, we will study about active remote sensing, and then we will move on to passive remote sensing. In active remote sensing, when the sensing device directs EMR at an object and detects the amount of that energy which is reflected back, then the process is known as active remote sensing. Some examples of active remote sensing are radar, lidar, and sonar. In radar, lidar, and sonar, the signals or the pulses are created by the sensor itself and radiated towards the target. When those signals or those pulses hit the target or in comes in the contact of the target, they get reflected back, and the sensor again captures those reflections and tells us the distance of the target. So this type of remote sensing process is known as active remote sensing. Whereas in passive remote sensing, the sensor always needs an external source of illumination or external source of energy to get or to capture the characteristics of a feature or object or phenomena. So we can understand this with the help of a very simple example. Okay, we all have mobile phones nowadays. In the broad daylight, if we are capturing a photo or a photograph with the help of our camera, we don't need to open the flashlight. Why? Because the energy of sun or energy of any other source of illumination, helping us to detect the object. Okay, but in night, in darkness, to capture the photograph of any feature, any person, any phenomena, we need to open our flashlight. So here the phone itself is sending its source of illumination, or is being its source of illumination, and then it is capturing the reflected energy. So the same mobile phone is working as a passive remote sensor in the broad daylight, whereas it is working as an active remote sensor in the dark or in the night. So this was the minute difference between active remote sensing and passive remote sensing. Now we will move on to advantages of remote sensing. Nowadays, it is very difficult to travel to some inaccessible areas or some areas which are very remotely situated. So, but as the research field is growing, the thirst to know about these remotely settled areas is also increasing. So, remote sensing here comes into play. Remote sensing helps the researcher or any person to get the information about inaccessible areas, practically inaccessible areas, or remotely settled areas which are far from the distance of a person's reach. With the help of satellite images, with the help of aerial photographs, drones, and cameras attached to airplanes, hot air balloons, we can now capture the imagery of those areas. So this is the first advantage of remote sensing. The second advantage of remote sensing is it is relatively cheap and rapid. If we want to collect a data of a area which is inaccessible to us, then we can just go to the website of remote sensing providing institutes, and from there we can download the remote sensing or satellite images of those areas. So it is very rapid, and some satellite images which are openly available or freely available, for which we don't even have to pay a penny, they are relatively cheap. Then it is basically very easy to handle, and it is easy to manipulate. We can manipulate the data according to our wish, and then we can use that data for various purposes. So these are the advantages of remote sensing. Now talking about the advantages, it is very necessary to look at the disadvantages of remote sensing as well. So moving on to the disadvantages of remote sensing. The first disadvantage of remote sensing is they are basically not error free. There is always a possibility that some kind of error is present in the satellite image, but they can be geometrically or radiometrically corrected and manipulated, so the user can use it according to its need. That is why they can be made error free, but there is always a possibility that the direct source or the direct data is not error free. After that, in remote sensing, if we are using the satellites to capture the data, there is always a possibility that satellite can get discalibrated sometimes. That is why it becomes somewhat difficult to capture the data. As in the advantages, we studied that it is relatively cheap, but it is cheap only when the remote sensing data is provided free of cost or at a very low cost. Otherwise, the data of some very high resolution satellites is very, very expensive. So this becomes the disadvantage of remote sensing data, that if we want to use a very fine resolution imagery, then we will have to pay some money for that, and it becomes expensive. So these are the disadvantages of remote sensing. We can think about various other advantages as well as disadvantages of remote sensing. One disadvantage of remote sensing can be that we need to have skilled labor or professionals to decode the signals that we are receiving from the satellites or from the sensors. Not every layman can be a skilled personnel for the decoding of the signals that are received from the sensor. Apart from that, sometimes uh, sometimes the phenomena which we are not expecting in our data comes in our data, like cloud cover. If we want information about any data, there might be some possibility that cloud cover will be there. So cloud cover is a information which we don't want, but it naturally is incorporated in our data. So this is also a disadvantage of remote sensing. So in this session we studied about types of remote sensing, which is active and passive remote sensing. Then we moved on to advantages and disadvantages of remote sensing. So that's all for today. In next session we will discuss about some new topics. Thank you so much.